This week on Getting to Know Jew, we talk with Elizabeth Rosin. Rosin is CEO of Rosin Preservation, which works on and consults for historic preservation projects, reviving old or rundown buildings. We talk about Rosin's work on the Empire State Building, being a transplant to Kansas City, and Jewish guilt. Hi, Elizabeth. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me, love.
So, right off the bat, historic preservation. Tell us a little bit about what that is and how you go about it. How do you start at, hey, there's this old rundown building, and end with, okay, it's all fixed up and better than ever, and everybody enjoy the neighborhood?
One of the first steps is research. It's really understanding the building, its neighborhood, its context, why it might be historic, what makes it significant. So when we talk about historic preservation, we're talking not just about buildings that are old, we're also talking about importance. So you may have a neighborhood where the whole neighborhood could be considered historic, or you may have a neighborhood that has one or two buildings that would qualify as historic. And the rest are really good quality vintage buildings, we like to call them, or retro buildings that contribute to the sense of place and are important in their own right, but they don't have enough importance or architectural integrity to merit some sort of formal designation. We work really closely with building owners to help them figure out the new use for their building. The programs that we work with help to provide financial incentives to building owners who rehab them in a way that protects their historic character while allowing them to be adapted for a new use. The end goal is to extend the economic life of older buildings. There's a lot of embodied energy in these buildings. You think about the natural resources and the energy that went into making the materials originally, that went into building them originally. We don't want to lose all that. When you tear a building down and you put those materials in the landfill, it's just, throwing all that away. And especially in this day and age when we care about sustainability and we think more about the environment, it's important to think about your buildings in that way as well. We hear a lot of people talk about, I have to replace the windows, the old wood windows in my building in order to be more energy efficient. And while it's true that older wood windows can leak energy, there are a lot of ways to improve their energy efficiency without replacing them. So I talked to people recently who said, but we're going to put in new wood windows. Well, that new growth wood is not going to be as durable or as hardy as the old growth wood that the original windows were made from. So restoring those windows, putting the effort into restoring those windows, making sure they're well sealed, maybe adding a storm window to provide that extra layer of insulation, that is going to gain you nearly as much energy efficiency as replacing them, not to mention the energy costs that go into fabricating a new window.
So it's all sort of really bundled together into the notion of sustainability and not just preserving historic buildings for the sake of, hey, this looks nice and we can keep using it, but it's better for the planet.
That's definitely a part of it. People pursue preservation for different reasons. And some it's about community, revitalizing community. Some it's about sustainability, and others it's both. We often will see, especially in smaller communities, maybe in a rural area, someone will come along and restore or rehabilitate one building, one key historic building in their downtown. And that will encourage the neighboring property owners. Maybe they don't undertake a project that's quite as extensive, but they might take a non-historic facade or screen off of the facade of their building and restore the front. They may take out a drop ceiling and find they have a decorative ceiling underneath that they didn't know was there. And slowly, incrementally, you see these little bits add up to a bigger whole, and you have your whole community becomes revitalized. One person puts a couple of apartments upstairs on a downtown building. And the next thing you know, there's a coffee shop and there's people living downtown who go to the coffee shop in the morning or in the evening or whatever it may be.
One of the buildings you've worked on to sort of get to a specific project is the Empire State Building in New York City, which you've described elsewhere as a really important turning point for Rosin preservation. What was that experience like, and why was it so important? Other than the obvious of like working on the Empire State, like not to sort of undercut the whole thing, you know?
So when a friend called and said, "Hey, would you want to work on the Empire State Building with me?" I don't think I hesitated for a split second. It was like, yes. What are we doing? And it was a fascinating project on a number of levels. One, they had gotten some advice at the beginning that made them think they did not qualify for historic tax credits. And so it was something they didn't pursue. But an accountant that they were working with later on in their project realized that they would qualify and connected them with our friend and then with us. And in part, where historic preservation has been in Missouri is ahead of a lot of other places in the country, especially a lot of places that people would consider more historic, like the Northeast. But because we've been working with these incentives for longer, we think about buildings in a different way, or we're really trained to be thinking about them, pushing the limits a little bit of what would be considered historic or not, what's allowable or not, how can a property owner take advantage of these incentives. And when we went out there, they were undertaking this massive rehabilitation. They restored the first floor lobby and the commercial spaces. They redid the visitor experience, which was on the second floor and then up at the 85th floor, 86th floor. And then the rest of it was like a giant spec office building. And, we've worked on a lot of office buildings from the 19-teens and 20s and 30s. And this was no different. It was just bigger. Mentally, for me, that it was a shift of, yeah, we could work on something like the Empire State Building because it's like the Kansas City Power and Light Building, but taller. There's really not much that's different between these two buildings other than their square footage.
That's kind of humbling as sort of an outsider to the field to hear someone go, "Oh yeah, the Empire State Building. It's just like another office building."
It is.
I also wanted to ask, I saw written somewhere that you had to face your fear of heights when sort of surveying the Empire State Building. That seems like an interesting combo of working on buildings and fear of heights. What happened in that situation?
I made a site visit. So above the visitor experience on the 86th floor, there's a second visitor level up on the 105th floor. And that's right below where the dirigible dock was, because that was supposed to be how you would visit the Empire State Building. You would arrive in one of these great dirigibles and float up to the mast and anchor and then get off and do your thing. So from the 105th floor, you walk up this like basically ship's ladder to the outside area on the dock. And they were getting ready to do some work up there that I needed to take a look at. And in the meantime, they had put down like plywood boards because a bunch of like drain pipes and conduit had been added to that level. So for safety's sake, they put plywood down over that so no one would trip. But that then raised the floor level a little bit higher relative to the guardrail. And adding a supplemental guardrail was one of the proposed elements of the project. And we were out there and the building manager was telling me how he had once gotten locked out there when he was, showing some celebrity around. And so I'm like, yeah, we're going back down right now. That was enough.
And just to make sure I'm historically anchoring myself, when you say dirigible, you mean like the Hindenburg?
Like the Hindenburg, yeah. It would have been awesome, but the wind currents were way too unsteady, and I would never have wanted to exit right there. That would have been terrifying.
Yeah, I'm also afraid of heights, and that does not sound appealing. I'm also curious, can you clarify, you mentioned historic tax credits. Can you sort of explain what that is a little bit? It's U.S. and state governments basically set aside some taxes just to restore buildings? Like what?
The historic tax credit is an incentive that's made available to the owners of historic buildings in exchange for them rehabilitating, investing in the rehabilitation of their property. So it's part of a group of incentives that are considered reinvestment credits. So it's not grant money. Essentially, your building is designated as historic. You complete a scope of work that's reviewed in advance and then reviewed upon completion. And if at the end of that construction, you have done what you were supposed to do, you will receive this credit against income taxes that are owed. And there's a credit available at the federal level, and there are also state credits available now in 37 different states across the country.
And can you explain a little bit sort of why the tax credits are so important? Because I know you've done some advocacy around proposed changes to these historic tax credits. And just as sort of a normal person, I'm air quoting right now for the listeners, can be kind of dense to understand. I'm sure for a lot of people who likely don't even know what to begin to ask their legislators about. So can you sort of get a little bit more into the why of the whole thing?
So the federal historic tax credit program has been around for a little over 40 years now. And it is a program that is documented to have a net positive effect on the federal treasury. And I don't know that there are many incentive programs that can claim that. This is a program that has created millions of jobs, affordable housing. It's helped to revitalize communities. It has worked in big cities and small towns in every state, District of Columbia, and the territories. It's based on merit and it's based on investment. And it's a program that appeals across the board, that always has really strong bipartisan support. People may like it for different reasons, but it's a unifying type of program. So after the 2016 election, there were a lot of issues that I was concerned about. And I felt like I needed to pick one that I could talk about very knowledgeably and passionately, but without emotion, if that makes sense. That was when I started advocating at the federal level, just visiting the Hill. This next week will be my 6th year doing Preservation Lobby Day, talking to legislators from both Missouri and Kansas. In the past, we've done Oklahoma as well, and just asking them to support some enhancements to the historic tax credit bill that are currently making their way around Capitol Hill. And it's great because it is a program that has really strong bipartisan support. There are folks that we've talked to who I may not agree on any other issue with, but they will become a co-sponsor of this bill. And it's just nice to be able to find that commonality, I think, especially today when our politics can be so divisive. To find any kind of common ground feels very hopeful.
Yeah, that seems like a fever dream to even consider things being bipartisan nowadays. And that's all we'll say about politics on this podcast. But I also want to rewind for a moment. I'm curious, how did you end up here? Why did you choose to study and do historic preservation? On your website, it says you got your bachelor's degree in anthropology and geography. So how did all of that sort of tie together into this?
So I had wanted to be an archaeologist from the time I was about 8. And that was what I went to college to study. And my freshman year, I took a cultural geography class to satisfy a distribution requirement. And it was about how Europeans settled the American continent and the types of settlements they created, the settlement patterns they created, and the building styles, like the house styles they created. So the difference between like New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the Tidewater South, and then how those patterns spread to the West. And it was really, really fascinating to me. And ultimately, I found that when you're studying history and buildings, you're able to answer a lot more questions than when you're studying prehistory. And so that was very satisfying. So that led me to get my master's in historic preservation, which in a lot of ways it's a pre-professional program, like a law degree or something, where you learn how to do the tasks that you need to work in this field. And I moved to Kansas City. My husband and I moved to Kansas City kind of on a whim, thinking it would be, a couple years. And that was in the early 90s. So it's just been a good place to live, an easy place to live.
That's how the Midwest gets you. Everyone thinks they'll come for a little bit and then they always just stay.
Next thing you know, it's 30 years later.
Yep. I'm also curious, what's the story around the creation of Rosin Preservation? At what point on this journey did you say, I want to do this on my own and I want to run it myself?
So I moved here to take a job with the city of Kansas City, Missouri. I worked in their planning department and was staffed to the Historic Preservation Commission. And this was when the city was doing comprehensive planning. So back in the early mid-90s, and it was the focus plan. And that was a really fabulous time to be working for KCMO. But around 1998 was when Missouri passed their state historic tax credit, created their state historic tax credit. And a friend and I had both kind of been involved with those conversations and the development of that legislation. And she's like, we should really go out on our own and do this. We should become consultants. And I was kind of ready for a change and just kind of leapt and went with it. So I was in a business partnership for about 7 years before starting Rosin Preservation.
And to take a pivot now into sort of explicitly Jewish stuff, in my experience, Jews tend to have a particular fascination with buildings and old places. We tend to be really nostalgic as a community, either because of sort of everything we've lost over 2,000 years of being mistreated, or because American Jewish memory of specific neighborhoods of being sort of new immigrants in the early 20th century is so strong, like, on the Lower East Side in New York City. And I'm wondering if any of that Jewish fascination has inspired you at all in sort of either deciding to do historic preservation or sort of on as you've been doing the work?
So that's a really good question. I don't know that there was anything necessarily about the Jewish experience that inspired me initially. I've always been interested in history, and it's something I've always been exposed to, even as a child and with my family. I think it may be something a little more innate, that kind of understanding history, that curiosity about people and places and how they go together and how they change may come from some of that. I don't know. I've never considered it in that light.
Have you ever taken even a slight detour? I know Kansas City, like a lot of other cities, anytime a sort of Jew or a Jewish family who's lived there for a long time, they'll always start pointing out neighborhoods where Jews used to live and stuff like that. Have you ever sort of taken a detour to be like, what does the sort of Jewish part of town look like?
Definitely. I mean, when you drive down Linwood Boulevard and you see there's the old synagogues and the old churches, and you get this understanding of place that was very different. As a transplant, I don't have those roots here, and I've moved around a lot as a child as well. So I've never had that connection, that same kind of connection to place. But my mom was from St. Louis. Her early years in East St. Louis before they moved to U City, and to start to understand those places now and see those places now, it does make me think about what were those changing dynamics. One of the first courses we had in graduate school was about reading the landscape. It's about how you look at buildings and understand the history that's embodied in them, the architectural style, how they're built, where they're built, how they relate to each other, what's the density, what's the spacing, what kind of streets do they face, what are the names of the streets, and then look at how they've changed over time. So everywhere I go, I have that filter on. And what is this place? What am I seeing? What has changed? What are the forces that have affected this? So yeah, I do think about like, okay, where was the Jewish community in Kansas City? And, it started off down like northeast, down near the river. And then, B'nai Yehuda was originally across the street from where City Hall is now before it, how it kept moving. The community has continued to move further south. Every once in a while, I'll be out somewhere in another community and stumble across a small synagogue, and it's always kind of fascinating. There's one in Cape Girardeau, this beautiful little kind of Moorish building right by the levee, right on the river, that is a remnant of a community, and I'm not sure where they are anymore. If they're still in Cape or not.
Interesting. And more broadly, I'd also like to know, obviously being Jewish is very multifaceted for a lot of us and inspires us in different ways. I'm curious, how has or hasn't your Jewish background inspired you? Because there are so many different ways that we draw from who we are, but also many of us are used to just being people and not always having our Judaism hanging over us, which I think is also good. We're all people. So where does that come down for you?
So I think being Jewish is an intrinsic part of who I am. Just sort of the values about curiosity and learning and wanting to make the world a better place than how I found it. That's just part of who I am at my core. I wouldn't call myself an overtly religious person by any stretch of the imagination. I love ritual, but I don't feel the need to. That sounds really weird.
Just to sort of take a really bird's eye view on the Jewish community, especially nowadays, there's so many sort of core parts of the community that are so focused on what the Jews are doing, when there are so many Jews who sort of in that same vein of what you were starting to say of we may like ritual, but don't always want to be sort of almost dragged into it, as it feels in a lot of community spaces, which is sort of hard for community leaders to hear sometimes, but it's also true for a lot of Jews. If you're okay with me saying, it almost felt like there was a semblance of guilt as you sort of started to say it and then backed off of it. But I think that's important for us to talk about openly. So if you want to say more, you're welcome to. If not, I totally get it. I just thought it was an interesting kind of box to open up.
I'd say I love ritual. That's part of history, right? Is understanding practice and sort of tribalism. But I'm not a very religious person. I'm more of a spiritual person, I would say. I love the idea of celebrating one of the Jewish holidays, and whether it's sitting at the Seder table or listening to Kol Nidre, and knowing that there are people around the world who are hearing and saying these very same words at the same time. To me, that feels very unifying and bonding, but I don't feel, I'm not compelled by observance on a routine basis. And yeah, I feel really guilty saying that. That's part of it too, right?
Yeah, I think that was a really good way to put it. You don't feel compelled by observance. I keep tefillin with me all the time. I have not worn tefillin since I was in Jerusalem in 2018. And so it's a very weird balance that we Jews tend to keep.
It is, and it's that whole dichotomy. It's the whole diaspora, right? And how you balance tradition with assimilation, and then not even just assimilation, but with being part of the community in which you reside and what that looks like. And for everybody, it's different and happens in different ways.
Right. To also take another detour, we sort of talked briefly about this before I hit the record button, but I want to bring this up now. The world is obviously having a wonderful time right now in Eastern Europe. For listeners, that is sarcasm, just in case somebody doesn't get that. Russia invaded Ukraine, is just committing a horrendous war there. Civilians are being bombed and under threat and, without food and water, and just a massive humanitarian crisis. But there's another crisis sort of tangential to that, which is there are so many historic buildings and parts of cities that are also being bombed to nothing, to rubble by Russia. And I'm curious, sort of your view as a historic preservationist. Of course, I'm sure most of your expertise is in the US, but what, if you can say it all on a global level, what comes next when such historic places around the world are destroyed?
Yeah, that's a really terrible situation. Like just thinking about the buildings and all of that history that's being lost. And you have to think that a big part of that is intentional as well, like destroying that sense of place and destroying that sense of familiarity. You saw a lot of that during World War II as well, on both sides, with how the Nazis bombed Britain and in London, and then how the Allies in response affected places in Germany. And how you choose to rebuild, there are so many different approaches to rebuilding, right? Do you try and recreate what was there, recreate that sense of history? Do you evoke that sense of history with something that reflects the scale, the massing, the color, the materials, but it has a new character? Or do you do something that's completely new? And there are different approaches. Plus, you need to meet the needs of the people. So if you're destroying, institutional buildings or commercial buildings, did they function well? Did they lay out well? Do they need a different type of floor plate? Is there a way to design them that's more efficient? If it's residential buildings, I know in the past, there's always been the thought, how do we get the most housing built as quickly as possible so that people have a home again? It will be interesting to watch how that comes together. And obviously it's way too soon to be anticipating what that will look like.
So the off-ramp from that to sort of more fun conversations sort of have two questions, but it's sort of one question to sort of finish out the podcast. The first aspect of it is, you talked a little bit about this, but when you look at Kansas City, the Midwest, what to your eye, what's so great about Kansas City? What do you see?
So Kansas City has always been, it's a place where people pass through from one place to another. It started with the Native Americans who would pass through here seasonally, the fur traders who came in the early 1800s, Lewis and Clark, and their expedition to the Santa Fe Trail, and then the railroad. So it's always been about moving people and goods from production to market. How do we go from, how do we get goods down to the Southwest? Well, Kansas City was the gateway to that. How do we bring agricultural products from Kansas, from Oklahoma? Well, you pass through Kansas City to get to the markets in Chicago and back east. And it's kind of fascinating to me that it's always kind of been this flyover place that people don't give enough credit to, when really it's an amazing place to live. It's an amazing community, rich with history and with culture and with fabulous people, that gets undersold too often.
And so the related aspect to that question is, when it comes to the Kansas City Jewish community, what do you love about it? And that's sort of the classic closing out question of this podcast.
That it is so diverse, that there are so many different components to it, I think is one thing. That it is so old and established and has such deep roots is another. It's fascinating to me that among the early business people at the town of Kansas, in the 1850s, were two Jewish merchants who had a dry goods store, and that there's been a Jewish presence in this area for closing in on almost 200 years. And so that's really fascinating to me, as somebody whose family hasn't been here for anywhere near that long, that there were Jews who came and ventured out and tried to claim a piece of the frontier, back in the day, always looking for a new experience and a new opportunity.
The Getting to Know Jew podcast is a product of the Kansas City Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish Federation of Greater Kansas City. It is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network and produced by Jewfolk Inc. Please rate, review, subscribe, and share. If you have suggestions for future guests, please email the show at webmaster@jewishkc.org.